if you have your Bibles or your cell phones, kindly go with me to the book of Acts, chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. So we've covered one third of the book of Acts, or we've almost covered one third of the book of Acts. Today we're going to be in Acts chapter 9, and we're looking at just 9 verses today. So usually over the last couple of weeks, we've been covering entire chapters, but today we're going to be looking at just 9 verses. This evening, we're looking at an event, at an incident in the life of Saul, who later became Paul, an incident where he goes from being an opponent of the gospel to a proponent of the gospel. And that's what I've titled my message, From Opponent to Proponent. So he goes from being an antagonist to a protagonist, or he goes from being a hater to a herald. So he goes from being a persecutor to a proclaimer of the gospel. And so that's why we're looking at 9 verses, because this is a seismic event in Christian history. And I think it's nice to slow down over here and learn some of the lessons that we can see from his transformation. So there was an atheist called Frank Morrison. He was an atheistic lawyer, and he said if we are to ensure that Christianity is completely eliminated or completely stopped, there are two events that we need to deal with. First is the resurrection of Christ, because Christianity is a resurrection religion. And so he says, first, we need to deal with that. We need to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. And the second thing is this transformation in the life of Apostle Paul. If we deal with these two events, we can undo Christianity. And in his journey of trying to do so, he found that the evidence for these two events, the historical evidence, was overwhelming, and he surrendered his life to Jesus. All that to say that the passage that we're looking at, the 9 verses that we're looking at today, is really important. And it's something that encourages each one of us, because if God can work in the life of somebody like Saul, he can work in any of our lives, or anybody's life who we're praying for as well. So I prefer, I've noticed that some preachers usually call this passage, this section, the conversion of Saul. I totally understand what they mean. I understand the sentiment. I don't like to call it the conversion of Saul, because he didn't go from being an atheist to a Christian. Neither did he go from, say, Islam to Christianity. He was already a devout Jew, and he already worshipped God. He worshipped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he did a very good job in trying to keep the law. But I prefer to call this in his own language. He said this is his own language, so I'm quoting him over here. I prefer to call this a call, either the time that he was called, because in the Greek, in Galatians chapter 3, he describes this entire event as the time that God called him. In Greek, it's kaleo. So or you can call it his revelation, which is apocalypsis. It's his apocalypsis or his kaleo, his revelation or his calling, not necessarily his conversion. He uses another word for conversion in Greek, which is epistrepho, which means somebody who turns away from their idols. When he's preaching to the Thessalonians, he says that they turned away, they were converted from the idols. But that's not what happened to Paul. He wasn't converted. He had a revelation that Jesus, who he thought was dead, was actually alive. And the people of the way, that's what they were referred to, the people of the way, were in fact right, and they were not heretics. And this is on the road to Damascus. He receives a revelation from the risen Lord. And so I've divided these 9 verses into a couple of sections. It's always helpful to have an outline, so that as we go through different verses, we have something to relate to. We can hang our thoughts on this outline, these divisions that I've made. So number 1 is Saul's introduction, because we need to look at Saul a little bit. But I've talked about Saul, I've talked about the Apostle Paul so much when we did the book of Colossians. I've talked about his 3 missionary journeys. Again, when when we were studying the book of Acts, he's already been introduced to us. So I'll be very brief when it comes to Saul's introduction. Then we look at Saul's intimidation. First is introduction, then is intimidation. Then we'll see Saul's interception. Then we'll see Saul's interrogation. Then we'll see Saul's instruction. Then we'll see Saul's inhibition. Then we'll finally see Saul's introspection. So we'll begin with Saul's introduction. Saul was born circa 5 AD in the city of Tarsus in Cilicia, modern day Turkey. And his parents were tent makers, and they taught him the skill of tent making. When he was about 13 years old, he was probably sent to one of his father's personal friends called Gamaliel, who was he was a rabbi who was well versed in the law. And sometimes Gamaliel was called the beauty of the law because he was able to articulate the law or explain it with such eloquence. And he was a very wise man. He was a very reputed rabbi in Israel. And so he was called the beauty of the law. And Paul studied under him. You find this in Acts chapter 22, I think it's verse 3. He says, I sat at the feet of Gamaliel. So he got his training from a renowned rabbi. And then he returns to Tarsus and he continues this skill that, he's working for his livelihood. He continues to make tents. Now, Saul was a very unique man. Therefore, as we are going to see, he had a very unique conversion. By birth, he was a Jew. By citizenship, he was a Roman. By conviction, he was a Pharisee. By education, he was a Greek. By tribe, a Benjamin. By grace, which is the most important thing, he was an apostle. By grace, he was an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. An apostle means somebody who's sent, and it's often connected with the word missile. So he was a very unique man, and he leveraged all these different connections. No, am I still audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Things are happening with my laptop. 1 second. Sorry about that. I hope I'm audible now. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So Saul was a unique man. He had a unique conversion. That's a little bit about Saul's introduction. Let's move on to the second thing, which is Saul's intimidation. Verses 1 and 2, I'll begin reading from Acts chapter 9. It says, Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were off the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So this is not the first time that we're seeing Saul in the book of Acts. We saw him back in chapter 7 when he held the courts of the people who stoned and therefore lynched Stephen, who was the first Christian martyr. And we saw him again in Acts chapter 8, verses 3, where he's continuing to persecute the church and he's dragging men and women and he's taking them to prison. And we also speculated that he might have been present in Acts chapter 5 in the meeting that the Sanhedrin are having and discussing the other disciples, the other apostles. He might have been there because he might have been the one who relayed the information to Luke, who writes the second account, the book of Acts. So he might have been there, he may not have been there, but we have a lot of details, things that Gamaliel spoke. Yes, the Holy Spirit could have supernaturally revealed those details to Luke, but chances are that Paul was there in that meeting in Sanhedrin, even though he's not mentioned. It is speculation, but we find him again here in chapter 1, and the spotlight is going to move from Peter and the other apostles now to Paul. But here he's known as Saul. Peter will come back a little bit later, but then after that he slowly fades out, and the focus, the spotlight is on Paul. So he's still, it says, then Saul, still breathing threats and murder. Some of your translations will say he was breathing out threats, murderous threats. The literal translation is he was breathing in threats. And what that means is his very life breath was to slaughter Christians. I mean, that was number one on his agenda, and it was taking up all his time. It was dominating his thinking. He was constantly thinking, how can he put an end to this new movement of Christianity, this new sect of Christianity that he thought he believed firmly were heretical and were really corrupting everybody else who was converting to their faith. And he goes to the high priest. Verses 1 says, he went to the high priest, who would have been Caiaphas, the same priest that was there during the ministry of Jesus, who presided over his trial. The same priest, he goes and he obtains permission to go to the city of Damascus. This, in the 1990s, the ossuary of Caiaphas was discovered south of Jerusalem on a hill. There were two caves, and they found different, I think, 2-3 ossuaries over there. And one of these ornately decorated ossuaries made of limestone, they found the remains of what they believed to be Caiaphas, but that was his family name, so his name was Joseph Caiaphas. And they found his remains, and they figured out that it was the remains of, I mean, you have all this advanced technology, so they found out that this was the remains of a man who was about 60 years old, and that corresponded with the age at which Joseph Caiaphas died. And so all this to say that the Bible is inspired. We're not reading some Asaph's fables over here or something. Every event, archaeology is often called the Bible's best friend. And so again, as we read all these details about the high priest, they all happened. It's not like some, something that he's concocting or fabricating over here. It all happened. It's all historical. So he goes up to the high priest Caiaphas, and he's obtaining permission. Verse 2 says, and asks letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus. Damascus was at the border of where Syria and Turkey meet today, and was a city that was about 2,200 feet above sea level. It was about 250 kilometers away from Jerusalem. It took about 6 days by caravan to go to Damascus. And so Paul is so passionate that he doesn't mind making the 6-day journey, because there are about 150,000 people living in the city of Damascus. And so he knows that Christianity is spreading over there. And the Christians over there, or the people of the way, and we look at that phrase a little bit later, the people of the way, or the Christians over there, had not yet left the synagogues, just like Jewish converts to Christianity hadn't left the temple in Jerusalem. They were going to the synagogues. People were still going to the temple in Jerusalem, Christians. And Christians in Damascus and other cities like Rome were still going to the synagogues, and they were proselytizing, they were evangelizing, they were talking about the gospel, and they were winning converts over. And so Paul knew that. So he says, give me permission to go to the synagogues. I'll bring all these people back. He wants letters that give him permission to arrest these people. And so that's what he does in verses 2. That's what it describes. He says he calls them men and women of the way. It's an interesting way of describing Christians. It's probably the earliest description of Christians. And the word Christian itself in the book of Acts comes only twice, and then once it comes in 1 Peter 4:16. Here, this phrase, the word the phrase "the way" is mentioned about 6, 7 times in the book of Acts, and it probably comes from that statement that Jesus made in John 14:6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So they people refer to them as people of the way, and also it's the way is described as a path that a person takes, or a road that a person goes down. This same phrase was used by Jesus in Matthew chapter 7 when he's talking about the broad way that leads to destruction and the narrow way that leads to eternal life. And he says, "Enter through the narrow gate." So the way is mentioned over there. Again, it's a journey. It's a journey that one makes. Acts chapter 8, the chapter that we studied previously, after Philip explained to the eunuch what he was reading, he explained this scriptures. When he expounded scriptures to the eunuch, it says that the eunuch went on his way. So Christianity is not just a road that you take, it's also a journey that you make. And then a way can be described as a way of thinking, a way of deciding. For instance, Acts chapter 16, the slave girl, the demon possessed slave girl, she says, these people, talking about Peter and his colleagues, she's saying, these people are explaining to you the way of salvation. So it's a way of thinking, it's a way of deciding, which is why these people were referred to as the way. And so he says, let me go to Damascus, let me find all these people who belong to the way, and let me bind them up and bring them back to Jerusalem, so they can be sent to trial and possibly even executed. So that is Saul's intimidation. We're done with his introduction. We looked at his intimidation. We'll move on to the third thing, which is Saul's interception. When sometimes when you drive around the city of Bangalore, especially when you're on the outskirts, there's one place where it happens quite often. There are these police interceptor vehicles, and so they basically have, I think they use laser technology. I'm not 100% sure about that, but whatever device they have, some sophisticated device in their vehicle which will tell them about 200 the vehicles that are approaching them, even 200 300 meters away. It will tell them the speed of the vehicle. And so there are some roads, and I've noticed they're always there in one spot on Airport Road. So on that Devnali Airport Road, they're always there in that same spot. And 2 3 times I was pulled over because they stand in this area where it's like a little bit downhill. It's a very straight road, and like you come out of a bend and then it's a straight road. You won't even realize that your vehicle is just going a little bit beyond 80 and goes to 90 kilometers, and they'll pull you over and they'll fine you. They'll give you a hefty fine. But after twice, I think twice I was caught. After that, I realized this is where they stand. So anytime after that, it's very careful in that area to ensure that I'm well below the speed limit, which is 80 kilometers. So in their case, I found out where they were standing. So whether I was coming, and I've come from Hyderabad entering Bangalore at least 15 times. So I knew that they'll always be, and they're always like clockwork. They'll be standing over the same place, during the day, they'll be standing over there. And so I became cognizant, I became aware of the fact that they're standing there. But Paul did not see this interception from God coming. He didn't know what was coming his way. Verses 3, it says, as he journeyed, so he's almost at the gates of Damascus, or near the walls of Damascus, the city of Damascus. And suddenly, it says, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. A light shone around him from heaven. The light, we're told, when Paul is explaining to King Agrippa in Acts chapter 26 about what happens, he says this light was brighter than the midday sun. It was a really bright light. Remember when I was a younger kid, I had a vision where I saw this light and I couldn't see anything. So bright that I couldn't see anything. So I'm not saying that Paul also is having a vision. I believe this really happened. It wasn't just a vision where he was he was seeing through his spiritual eye. This really happened. Jesus was there. This light, Jesus was there in the intersection of heaven and earth. He was there, and he was going to confront Paul. And so it's a light that's really bright. Now again, I'm thinking of Revelation chapter 22, where it talks about how in the New Jerusalem there'll be no more night, and it says God itself will be their light, and it talks about how here they will reign forever and so on. But it talks about how there's no sun over there, there's no more night in the New Jerusalem. God himself is a source of pure light, He himself is very bright. He himself is very radiant. And I believe that's what Paul saw here. It was a very bright light that completely blinded him. And I remember I have to say, a very reputed teacher, well-known teacher of the Bible called David Pawson, who is no more. He's with the Lord. And I remember he said something fascinating about light and something about precious jewels. And he was saying how he was talking about how the Bible is inspired, how it's so true. And he was saying, look at this fact. And he pointed out this one fact about the New Jerusalem. He said, when you go to Revelation chapter 21, I think it describes the 12 stones that will be used to build the New Jerusalem. And some of these stones are very beautiful. Some of them you might have seen in person. From the top of my head, some of them I remember stones like topaz, stones like jacinth, like jasper, like chrysolite, like sardonyx, and so on, right? So there are all these precious stones, and he says they are all anisotropic precious stones. And if you pass light through them, we know that God is light. If you pass light through them, it turns out whatever color they start off with that is the stones, it turns into the colors of the rainbow. But there are some stones that don't do this. And one example is diamond. If you pass light through a diamond, the only color that you'll get is black. It'll just be like coal dust or something. And interestingly, diamond is not there in the New Jerusalem. So God, even back in the time when he was giving this revelation to John, who probably wrote it on the book of Revelation on the island of Patmos, even there, God knew all the stones that would turn out to be like into these beautiful patterns, into the colors of the rainbow. But he knew things, there are certain stones like diamonds that will just stay black in color when light passes through. And so it's a bright light over here that completely blinds Saul. Let's move on now to his interrogation. So some people say he was knocked off his high horse. You can use that metaphorically. And there are times that even I've said he was literally knocked off his high horse. There's nothing here that says that he was riding a horse, but the chances are he probably was. I mean, that's how many of them travel. But there's nowhere in the Bible does it say Paul was riding a horse and fell down from the horse. He could have been in a caravan or something else. But it knocks him down. And in verses 4, we're going to look at his interrogation. He falls to the ground. He hears a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, whom are you persecuting? Or why are you persecuting? Many of your translations will say, why are you persecuting me? And when you think of Jesus in the Bible, there are times he says, Martha, Martha. Sometimes when he's weeping over Jerusalem, he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Here he's saying, Saul, Saul. So it's a stone of compassion. There's something that is really grieving Jesus. And so he's saying, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Sometimes our focus is on the persecute me, and that talks about his intimacy. But also the question, why? It talks about it goes to show us that it's a very frivolous thing to do, or it's something that's very nonsensical to do when you're persecuting the church of God, because you're going against God himself. And none of us, no human being, regardless of how powerful they are, regardless of their ideologies, regardless of their supporters, can stand against God. So it doesn't even make sense to persecute God or his church. So even that why, it's like, why are you persecuting me? It doesn't even make sense to persecute me. You can't win against God. And also, of course, persecute me goes to show how close he is, or how closely, intimately connected he is with his people, his church. So why are you persecuting me reminds me again, I always like to say something that helps me worship God: his transcendence and his immanence. Transcendence means he's the great God, he's lofty, he's high, he is the God of the impossible, he is untouchable, nobody can defeat him. Those kind of things, all his great attributes that make him who he is, God. And then his immanence, in spite of the fact that his thoughts are higher, his ways are higher, he's also immanent. He comes close to his creatures who surrender to him. You draw near to him, he draws near to you. He's a rewarder of those who seek him diligently. So his transcendence on one hand, his immanence on one hand, is showcased in this one question that Jesus asked him. And I've always found that whenever it's questions really make people think. He didn't just confront him saying that he did something wrong. He asked him a question that would get him thinking. And then he goes on in verses 5, that is Paul. He said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the word Lord over here means it's just a term of respect. Even if you look at it in the Greek, which I did, it's in the vocative case. I'm not going to explain that, but it's in like small letters basically. It's just a term of respect. When you call somebody Lord, it doesn't mean that they're actually your Lord. And that's how it was used over here. So he says, "Who are you, Lord?" So it's not like he knew that it was the Lord and he's saying, "Who are you, Lord?" That doesn't even make sense. He was just saying, "Who are you, sir?" And then the Lord said, "I am Jesus." Now Jesus reveals his identity. He says, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting." He goes on in the version that I'm currently reading. He says, "It's hard for you to kick against the goads." So then in verses 6, Paul says, "So he, trembling and astonished, said, 'Lord, what do you want me to do?'" So there's one question that Jesus asked Paul. He said, "Saul, Saul," I keep calling him Paul because that's how we know him. But he asked Saul, at that time he was Saul. In Acts chapter 13, I think he becomes Paul, goes from being Saul to Paul. Here there's one question that Jesus asked him, and there's two questions that Paul asked Jesus, right? So the first one is, "Why do you persecute me?" And then Saul says, "Who are you?" And then he says, "What do you want me to do?" And I think these are two very pertinent questions. Asking first, figuring out who is Jesus. And that's a question that I can even ask right now, being a Christian. It's not like I don't, but just to affirm or just to be assured of the fact that he is, in fact, Lord of my life. Like, if I ask myself, I think it's a healthy question to ask myself, even though I'm a Christian today. Sometimes think, "Who are you, Lord? Who are you in my life? Are you my life coach, or are you my Lord? Are you my motivator, or are you my master?" Questions like that. So it's very important to ask him, is he just somebody who encourages you, or is he everything to you? And then the second question is, what do you want me to do? That's another question that I think even on a daily basis we can ask the Lord, and he will tell us what he wants us to do. So these are two pertinent questions, very important questions that Paul asked the Lord. This, I just want to briefly address a couple of things in these two verses under Saul's interrogation. The first thing is, most of the translations, depending which translation you have, so if you have a KJV or if you have an NKJV, you'll have this additional question where he asks, "What do you want me to do?" It's omitted in any other translation like NIV, NLT, and all the NASB, SB, all those translations eliminate this one phrase, say, which said the second question, "What do you want me to do?" It also eliminates that phrase or leaves out the phrase, "It's hard for you to kick against the goads." Now, I feel this question, it doesn't matter whether it's there or not in the original, because as I've said before, once before, that was his disposition. Saul was ready to do what the Lord required of him. And so whether he asked it, whether he didn't ask it, didn't matter. He was willing to do what the Lord asked. So that was his attitude. So he might have verbalized it, he may not have verbalized it, but that's how he felt towards Jesus when he heard him. So it doesn't matter. The second thing about "it's hard for you to kick against the goads" is I don't think it was there in this particular text, but it comes back a little later in Acts chapter 26. There he mentions it when he is narrating the events of his story, his Damascus Road experience, to somebody else. He mentions it over there. So I feel like a scribe must have thought it'll be more helpful to add it in over here, and it'll be more consistent. I don't think it's there. It's not there in the earliest of manuscripts over here, but it does come later. This thing of "it's hard for you to kick against the goad," and I think a goad was like a long stick with like a sharp end, which the farmer would use to prod or to poke the animal to get it to go. And sometimes the animal, being really stubborn, would kick back against this, and it was worthless to kick back against something so sharp, because it would end up getting hurt. And so basically Jesus over here was saying, "It's hard for you to kick against the goads," as in it's useless, it's worthless to kick against the goads. I'll get you eventually. So that's just some clarification on these two things. And again, I'm just thinking, and I'll talk about this sometime and I'll explain it in detail. When it comes to the KJV and the NKJV, it's based on something called all the science of the science of translating from the original language, that is Hebrew and Greek and all those things. It's a science called textual criticism, which is basically all these scholars sit around and they decide what should be the final translation, because we know that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. We know the New Testament is written in Greek, and probably Jesus spoke and the disciples spoke in Aramaic. And so when they translate it, they have to translate from the original languages, and we end up with all our different translations today. So the NKJV, the KJV used a method called textus receptus, which is there's one guy called Erasmus who had like about a dozen Greek manuscripts, and he uses those manuscripts to write or to make the KJV translation in the 16th century. And some of this, so many of the KJV people who hold to KJV, and some KJV only people say it's based on majority text. And the way they explain it is KJV, the translation or the NKJV, is more reliable, is more credible, because the method that scholars use is they take all the manuscripts and majority wins. So if there are 100 manuscripts that says, for example, Jesus was happy, and there are 3 manuscripts that say Jesus was sad, they'll choose the Jesus was happy. And on the surface, that seems like a really smart thing to do. Majority wins. But the problem, the issue with that majority wins is it doesn't take into account the times those manuscripts came out. It doesn't take into account the locations of those manuscripts, whether they were translating from the Latin Vulgate, whether that was a 16th century manuscript. So obviously, when it comes to manuscripts or copies, we don't have the autograph. That's the original writings of the apostles. It's all copies of copies. So when it comes to this, earlier the better. It's not like, because KJV also takes some later manuscripts. And so I can point out even now, but that's not the purpose of this study. Some of the additions, even in the KJV, I can show you that are not there in the earliest manuscripts. But that's not our study right now. We can do it another time. So every translation, all this to say, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the other translations use something called the eclectic method, where they don't just take the majority of manuscripts. They have a bunch of rules. It's called critical textual criticism, where they have a lot of these rules where they decide and they deliberate back and forth which is the earliest manuscripts, which makes the most sense, which has the most mistakes, which would have been additions. And that's how you get NIV, ESV, and all the other NLT and all those kind of things. So all this to say, each translation has its pros and cons, and we have to figure out which one suits us, which one helps to edify us, and so on. So that's why over here the NKJV includes these 2 statements that are not there, I believe, in the original and in other translations. So that is a little bit about Saul's interrogation. We'll move on now to Saul's instruction. So after this time of questions back and forth, you move to the instruction, verses 6. It says, he said to the Lord, God tells him, arise and go. That is, Jesus tells him, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what to do. So he receives this set of instructions, which are very direct and clear. And I was just thinking about this. I was meditating on this verse and thinking, wow, those instructions, like, you can't go wrong, right? Like, it's so explicit. You can't misunderstand those instructions. And yet I was thinking, as I was looking at this verse, I was thinking, Lord, but today there are so many times we don't get instructions like this, and we don't know what to do. We don't know what the next step is. If you told me today, I want you to get up, I want you to accomplish this at 4:30, I want you to go there, I want you to talk to that person, all those kind of things, maybe I'll have more purpose. Maybe I'll be very excited about going through my day because God spoke to me and told me I must do this, like you did to Paul. But this was something that, and again, I don't want to say that there are times that we don't receive these sort of direct instructions, and for a fact it's God speaking to you, telling you to do something specific, which is what's happening over here. Paul receives a set of specific instructions and he carries them out, as we'll see later on. But I want to say that it doesn't happen to Paul all the time that he receives instructions. This was during his transit. This was a very radical event in his life, a very dramatic event in his life, where he sees this bright light, and he falls down, and he asks this question. He's shocked, he's shaken, he's taken aback, and it's during that time that where God gives him these specific instructions. I mean, just to drive this point home. The same Apostle Paul, right? I mean, you think, oh, maybe he was special or something because he was an apostle, and he was an apostle not only to the Jews but also to the Gentiles. He went to the ends of the then known world, and he had a very important mission. So maybe he was unique, maybe he was special, maybe God won't speak to me like this. But just to show you, he's the author of Thessalonians. In Thessalonians chapter 3, he's talking, I think it's about sending Timothy over to the Thessalonians or something like that. And he says, I actually, if we were in person, I would read out all these verses, but I just want to go through them really quickly. There are three verses. He says, we thought it best, we thought it was good that we sent Timothy over to you. So he's not receiving some special unique revelation during that time. He's just saying we thought it best. We thought it was good to send Timothy. They're just using, in other words, they sanctified common sense. They're seeing what's best, what suits the situation, what would be advantageous, and they send Timothy over. Another example, Philippians chapter 2, verses 25, is in the context of Epaphroditus. And he says, I thought it, because he falls sick when he visits Paul. He says, I thought it necessary. So it was a necessity. Out of necessity, God never told him, I want you to send Epaphroditus back to the place that he came from. He's feeling sick, he's homesick, send him. No specific instruction. Thought it necessary, he did it. He sends it back, he writes a letter. Another example, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 3 and 4. He's talking about offertory, and he says, if it is fitting, I will join that team that's bringing the offertory. And maybe, some people say maybe it was something below the size of the offertory or something, size of the gift or something. But the point is, he's using language like this: best, good, necessary, fitting, advisable. And so often that's how we ought to make our decisions today. I mean, people they become a little bit indecisive because they're waiting for this direct revelation of God to tell them precisely what to do. And if he doesn't do it, then they're very indecisive, and they say, God has not spoken to me, I don't know what he wants me. Very often we just need to be like Paul and do what is good, what is necessary, what is advisable in that moment. Consult godly people. Proverbs says, in a multitude of counselors there's safety. And so Paul receives over here a specific set of instructions, but it may not always be like that. Sometimes God does give specifically, he speaks directly, but sometimes he speaks the other ways that he did to Paul, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, maybe through the leading, through the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So that is to do with Paul's instruction, verses 6. We'll move on to Saul's inhibition, verses 7 and 8. And the men who journeyed with him, so he obviously was not alone. He probably had the temple police along with him. He wasn't going alone to threaten those people. He had company. The men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice but seeing no one. So they heard something, but they didn't see Jesus. And they were also obviously shocked, shaking in their boots. And verse 8 says, Then Saul arose from the ground, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no one. But they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus, which is why I've called this point Saul's inhibition, which means the hindrance or the obstacle, or the impediment that he was experiencing during that time. He opens his eyes and he cannot see anybody, and so he's led by the hand. This leader who was leading other persecutors along with him, the temple police, and he was leading from the front, now has to be taken by the hand and led by others. What a humbling thing. But that's how God was working in his life. He was doing a work in him. He was preparing him. He was equipping him. And he was showing him that he was powerless at that moment. He was showing him that he needed to be led, that he was helpless. And that's why God said, why do you persecute me? And that's why I was focusing on that point. It's absolutely worthless to try and fight against God. There's no chance that anybody can win fighting against the almighty and infinite God. And so this is again talking about his inhibition. He does that so that he has this wilderness period, if you will, just like Moses. Of course, his period was 14 years. Paul's is only like 3 days, as we'll see. Even Jesus, he was in the desert for 40 days, 40 years. Moses, 40 days. Jesus. They all went through that time, the time of testing, a time of struggles where they had to lean on God, where they realized they were apart from Him, they can do nothing, and where the Spirit ministers to them, equips them, refines them. And so this is 3 days is Paul's time over here. He's blind. He's really taken aback. And then finally, the last point is Saul's introspection, where and I'll read verse 9. He says, "And he was 3 days without sight and neither ate or drank." So for 3 days, he was so taken aback by the events that he was just processing everything. A lot has happened in a very short span. And so he's thinking about everything that he saw, that he encountered. He was trying to make sense of it. He was probably, I've named it introspection because of course I mean we can only speculate over here. Why did he eat and drink? Because he must have been thinking about what he just saw, and he probably realized that he's going around persecuting all these people of the way, aka the Christians. And they are right. They do believe in a risen Messiah, and they're not heretics after all. And he's gone around and he's troubled them so much. He's dragged them to prison. So he must have been repenting during that time. He must have been regretting some of the. He must have been full of remorse. And so it's his introspection. He's looking within, looking deep within. I like what C.S. Lewis says, and I want to read it out for you regarding this entire incident that we looked at today. He says, God was the divine chess player. God was the divine chess player who was maneuvering the chessboard and backing Saul of Tarsus into a corner until Jesus finally said, checkmate. So God was maneuvering the chessboard in such a way. God was the divine chess player in this. He was orchestrating all the events in his life up till then. He was maneuvering the chessboard. He was moving all those pieces on the chessboard until Jesus finally in Acts chapter 9 says, Paul, checkmate. It's done, it's over, it's finished. And Paul is confronted by the risen Messiah, by the risen Lord, and he surrenders from there on. And that's why this is such an important event for Christians and also for people who are, seeking and just on a journey where they're trying to figure out whether Jesus is real, because this man was truly a persecutor of Christians. I mean, if you read about his background, all the things he did, he was so strong in his Pharisaical convictions, so passionate about the law, and his transformation from that. It's very difficult to deny that he believed in the risen Messiah and that the Messiah really did appear to him. And so, just to briefly, even in our lives, yeah, and I've given about 6 7 points over here in our lives when it comes to our introduction, right? I mean, we don't choose the parents that we're born to. We don't choose the family or the nationality, the race, I don't choose the color of my skin or my eyes or the color of my hair. None of us get to choose those things. God decides all those things, decides the time, decides everything, the families that we're born in, the education that we're going to get, and all those things. So that's a little bit about our introduction. When I was talking about intimidation, we may not be persecutors of the church or anything, but there was a time of there's BC, basically all of us before Christ, right? So before we gave our lives to Christ, maybe some of us gave it really early. And I just want to say over here, sometimes when people read Paul's testimony, they say, wow, that's amazing, because it was so drastic, it was so dramatic. I wish I had a testimony like Paul, where I was, writing, I was going to persecute Christians, and I was so passionate, I was so fiery, and then suddenly God just comes and confronts me when I'm going somewhere and I see this bright light. I wish my story, I wish I could share, because this testimony will get a lot of like hearers, and people will be really impressed with my testimony. But I want to say, even if you're somebody who didn't live like a life of scandalous sins and go very far away like the prodigal son in Luke 15, you didn't commit all these serious sins that people will consider absolutely disgusting. It doesn't matter even if you were saved at a young age, because that is a powerful testimony to the keeping power of God. He saved you at a young age, and your life is an example of the keeping power, that he could save you at such a young age, capture you at such a young age, you're smitten by him at such a young age, and then he keeps you throughout, and you've been consistent in your pursuit of him. That is also a powerful testimony. Not just the person who strays away really far and then suddenly radically. That's also in one sense powerful. This is also. So we should never, because I guess somebody said it, because before, that is, we're talking about this, before Christ, right? So before Christ, all of us were dead, right? So there's no degree of deadness. I was very dead. I was little dead before I came to Christ. You're dead in your sins. You're dead in your trespasses. And so he makes us alive, which is all of us have that testimony. If we believe in Christ, that is our testimony. We have various backgrounds, various ways in which God saved us. Some of us, like this, just in one day, one instance, maybe click, Jesus is the way. And we gave up our life of sin, we gave up our life. For some of us, it was a season. For me, it was more of a season. I believe that I was saved and I understood the things of God at a very young age. I believe I was saved at a young age, but I was one of these Christians who was like a sort of like on a seesaw, one leg in the world, one leg. It took me a long time. Went through the school of hard knocks, ashamed of some things that I did, all ashamed of some things that I did. Went through a journey where I was finally convinced that I want to surrender completely to God because He owns me, and that's the best thing to do. That He's a good God, and it's absolutely. I mean, my life will be meaningful only if I surrender to Him, not living half-heartedly here and there kind of a Christian, a lukewarm kind of a Christian. And so that is our intimidation. If you think about, we talked a little bit about God's interception in our lives as well, how He intercepts, how He stops us in our tracks. It looks different for each one of us. During those times, there might be times when we wrestle with certain questions, just like Paul did. We saw two pertinent questions. I mean, even to begin with, that poignant question that Jesus asked him. He says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And maybe Jesus asked us not that exact same question, but he asks us questions like that that really help us get fresh perspective, that help us realign our thoughts and help us fix our eyes on him and not the waves around us. And he asks us these kind of questions from time to time, even as we do life with him. And we go back and forth. So much of faith is not always, having the right answers or knowing the answer to everything. So much of faith is asking the right questions also. Like, I mean, now I'm trying to think of an example for what I said. So supposing you're going through like a hard season, it's not always trying to understand why am I going through this season. It's not always trying to figure out or decipher the answer. Maybe the right question to ask in a season of suffering is, does God still care for me? And I think that sometimes is the right question to ask. Does he care for me because he's allowing me to go through this situation? If the answer is yes, you will be encouraged in that situation. If you can say without a doubt, God definitely cares for me. I mean, I open up his word and he cares. If he cares about the sparrow falling, somebody said God attends the funeral of every sparrow. If he cares about the sparrow falling to the ground, he definitely cares about me. He who knows every hair, I mean, the number of hair that I have on my head. He knows my thought. He knows it from afar. He knows when I sit, when I stand, wherever I go, I can't hide from his presence. I am precious to him. Even when I was a sinner, Romans 5 says he died for me, shed his blood for me. How much more would he save me now, being a Christian, walking with me? So my interaction with God, even on a daily basis, where I might ask him questions, he might ask me some questions, all to sort of egg me on, or sort of all these questions act as a catalyst that builds me up in my faith. And like I said, sometimes we get some very clear instructions from the Lord. We get this clear revelation. We know this is what he wants us to do. This, we are in the center of his will. And sometimes we're a little bit dubious. We're like wondering, does God want me to do this? And it's okay. In those situations, we do what we think is best. We use the help of the Spirit. We do what is necessary. We do what is fitting, what is appropriate, what will honor God, what will please him. So we follow, as long as we're following his moral will that is described in the Bible. Sometimes there is freedom to make decisions when we're wondering which one, and they're all neutral decisions. They're nothing inherently sinful or something like that. So then there are times, even as we saw for Paul, there are times of testing. There are hindrances, there are obstacles. We call that point Saul's inhibition. So there are times where there will be obstacles. There'll be times of refinement that will cause us to introspect, that will cause us to spend some time thinking, God, why are you allowing me to? But all that to say that we come back. We come back saying, we assure ourselves, we have this inner dialogue, just like the psalmist said. He spoke to himself. He said, why, oh my soul, are you downcast? And he speaks, he's preaching to himself. He says, put your hope in God. So all this, even as we look at the life of Paul, reminds us God is in control. And even if we are praying for somebody that is precious to us, it seems unlikely, like they're going to come to God in the natural. In the natural, it seems like there's no chance for them. They're really far away. or they're really, really apathetic towards the things of God. They really don't care about God. They're very skeptical. If he could do it for somebody like Paul, there's no chance. Nobody would have thought that Paul would have turned around, that he would have had this dramatic transformation on the road to Damascus. But God gets his attention. So it's not like only people who are like just on the verge. Of course, they are at an advantage. People who are groping for God, people who are reaching for God, God will respond to. The rewarder of those who seek him diligently. But that does not mean he can't confront somebody who's totally opposed or antagonistic towards his. God is powerful. He can do anything. That is the story of Paul. So that's Acts chapter 9, verses 1 to 9. I wanted to put the brakes on, go, like a speed breaker, because it's a very important section in the book of Acts. And after this, the focus, the spotlight will be on Apostle Paul. And so that's why I wanted to take our time to go through these 9 verses. So now I would love to hear from you what you think of the Apostle Paul, how he ministered to you, something he said, not necessarily just on these 9 verses, maybe connected to that. But anyway, any way that Paul has impacted your life, his writings, anything he says, then, what you thought of these verses.